Episode 2, The Insane Ghost of Mrs. Bouchard and Bea Robinson.
Should I say, because I would say Bea Turek Robinson.
Okay,
I would sign it as but I never put my name BEA. So a lot of times they didn't know if I was a female or a male.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Because I would sign it just with the B.
Sure.
And then Turek Robinson.
In October of 2020, I got my first sit-down interview with the surviving matriarch of the Robinson family, Bea Robinson.
I'm Bea Robinson, illustrator of the New England Ghost Files.
Although Chip himself did achieve some level of regional fame for the New England Ghost Files, his mom Bea is sort of the unsung co-hero of the book. If you were lucky enough to get your hands on one of the now out-of-print books, you'd certainly remember the illustrations. They're really hard to forget. On a personal level, the drawings have always been one of my favorite parts of the book. It's arguable that the illustrations that accompany the stories in the Ghost Files are, frankly, equally as off-putting as the stories themselves. Creative, memorable, beautiful, but off-putting. The original artwork that I was able to scan from Bea now works as our episode covers if you haven't taken notice yet. All the original prints will also be available online to view. To have a chance to interview the illustrator herself was exciting for me. What was more exciting was able to look through all of Bea's original hand drawings from the book that she now keeps in this massive folder that stands, well, about as big as she is. That's another random point I'd like to make here, just to give you some perspective. Bea's just a tiny thing of a person. Petite, fragile, but at the same time, clearly put together. You can see that her level of detail doesn't just apply to her illustrations, but also to herself. I really want to start with the book illustrations. Like, what was the first conversation when Chip writes this book, and then you're like, okay, did he outright ask you to write the illustrations, or how did that conversation happen?
Yeah, well, he just mentioned that he was going to be doing this book on ghosts, and he was going to interview, someone else, and I said, well, I would be, I'd love to try, and I'd love to do that, because I graduated RISD as an illustrator, majored in illustration. So, and I said I would be willing to, and I'd love to, to try these ghosts. So, and that's how we started. And
so you had basically interview with your own son for your illustration.
Yeah, right. Sort of, almost, because he would read me the story that he wrote, and then he would give me an idea of what he wanted, and then from there I would, do the illustration, or I would do and I would, he would approve it, and it seemed that it happened and worked out all the time that I would capture what he wanted, and he would approve it and like it, and he would just continue on.
Now, as a writer, was he really good with his descriptions with that? Like, were you able to kind of nail them right away, or were there some that were more difficult than others?
Well, he just gave me kind of a rough idea. It wasn't a really detailed. It was more a feeling, what the feeling of the story, and what feeling he wanted me to try to portray in my drawing.
Do you have any favorites?
Favorite drawings?
Yeah. Well, you were just talking about the attic one.
Yeah, the doll.
You want to talk about that a little bit?
And yeah, that doll that has kind of scared me doing it, because I have this, from childhood, kind of uncomfortable feeling about it, especially these antique dolls, China dolls, with little teeth. So I felt uncomfortable doing that drawing.
And it's this drawing here that accompanies the first story in the book. I'll have Eric share that with you right now.
Ghost File Number 1. The Insane Ghost of Mrs. Bouchard. Location, Waterbury, Connecticut. Number of witnesses, 2+. Interview dates, November 1992, December 92, and February 1993. When Tina and Kenny Lusk, both professional pilots, purchased their Waterbury, Connecticut home in June of 1990, the elderly seller felt obliged to warn them about a disturbing presence in the attic. The couple attributed the man's curious remark to eccentricity and chuckled it off. Before long, they proceeded to take up residence in the charming Victorian. About a year later, while storing some supplies in the attic, Kenny noticed that an old rocking chair left by a previous owner began to frantically rock back and forth by itself. The chair sat in the corner of the attic, and when Kenny approached it, the rocking suddenly stopped. "I just kind of shrugged it off at first," Kenny says. "I attributed it to a draft passing through and left it at that." 4 weeks later, while preparing to go to bed, the couple began to hear loud thumping noises above their bedroom. The sounds were emanating from the attic. The thumpings repeated themselves every 3 or 4 nights, but each time he checked the attic, Kenny found nothing that could adequately explain the strange noises. In early August of 1991, the manifestations became more unsettling. While playing with their dog out in the yard, Tina glimpsed a movement in one of the attic windows. She looked up, and through the window, she could see a dark figure moving strangely. The figure seemed to be dancing, Tina recalls. "I couldn't make it out well enough to tell if it was a man or a woman, but it was twirling and throwing up its arms as if in a dance." Tina immediately fetched Kenny in the kitchen, and the couple rushed upstairs to check the attic. Finding nothing, they came back downstairs, where Kenny began to poke fun at Tina. "He told me that I was letting my imagination run wild because of what the seller had told us," Tina recalls. "Still, I didn't see how he could take it so lightly, considering that he himself had heard those strange thumpings in the attic late that night. But I guess he just wasn't ready to accept the idea of a haunting. He's a very rational person. As for me, the figure I had seen in the attic window was very disturbing to me. Although Kenny was able to half convince me that I had probably just seen a moving shadow up in the window, maybe a draft rustling through some old dresses hanging in the attic." 3 months later, while Kenny was away piloting a charter flight, Tina began painting the pantry. Since the painting supplies were stored in the attic, she reluctantly had to go up. "While I was up there, I couldn't believe how nervous I was getting," she recalls. "My whole body was shaking. Still, nothing unusual happened, and I went back downstairs feeling a bit more relaxed." That afternoon, Tina made several more trips to the attic for additional supplies. "I got more and more relaxed each time," she says. "But on my 4th trip to the attic, all of that changed." While bending over a box, Tina began to hear a strange tapping noise coming from the corner of the attic, where an old raggedy doll sat propped up in a chair. "When I looked in that direction, I saw something absolutely bizarre," she nervously recalls. "You are going to think I'm crazy, but, well, the arms of the old stuffed doll were clapping and moving frantically, like some invisible force was manipulating them. I just froze and stood there in absolute terror. Then, a few moments later, the doll came flying in my direction, like something invisible had picked it up and thrown it at me. At that point, I rushed out of the attic, screaming at the top of my lungs. When I got downstairs, I ran out of the house." Tina spent the rest of the afternoon at the home of a neighbor. When Kenny returned later that evening, she decided not to tell him what happened, fearing that he might think her crazy. As soon as I was back in the house, I was a nervous wreck, she says. Kenny noticed my nervousness and asked me what was wrong, but I was still hesitant to tell him. The following morning, though, he himself had a strange experience in the attic. After that, he began to agree with me that something up there was definitely not right. I went up into the attic to look for my model airplane glue, Kenny explains. I was rummaging through one of the boxes when suddenly I saw the strangest thing. I saw, well, an elderly woman slowly crawling across the attic floor on her hands and knees. I stood there, sort of dumbfounded, as she crawled past me, turning her head and grinned at me strangely, and then she proceeded to crawl on all fours towards the attic wall. When she reached the wall, she passed right through it and vanished. And then, for just a few moments, I could hear this strange, muffled chuckling coming from inside the wall. It was the most frightening thing I have ever experienced. Kenny has no idea why the apparition was crawling on all fours, though he indicates that the woman's facial expression looked completely insane. After Kenny's bizarre experience, the couple began to argue about the house. Tina wanted to sell it, but Kenny, reluctant to give up on a home that both he and Tina were very fond of, felt that they should try to face their problem. At least that's how Kenny felt at first, Tina says. But things eventually changed. My neighbor works at a library and is a consultant to several historical societies. He helped us research the house. We found out that one of the home's original owners, an elderly woman named Mrs. Bouchard, went insane and starved herself in the attic in either 1878 or 1879. We were at a loss about what to do. We even talked to our priest about it, but he didn't want to get involved. In the meantime, the ghostly manifestations continued. Nighttime rappings still emanated from the attic late at night. An oil painting stored in the attic was found inexplicably defaced, and Tina's sister, Catherine, fled the yard in hysterics after seeing an elderly woman staring down at her from one of the attic windows. The couple became increasingly desperate and frightened. In July of 1992, Kenny and Tina sold the Connecticut home to a businessman from Rhode Island. For reasons only known to him, he was unavailable for an interview. The man quite suddenly moved out of the house and placed it on the market in January of 1993, merely 6 months after moving in. Did he, too, encounter the insane ghost of Mrs. Bouchard? At the time of this writing, the house is still on the market.
Husband was very good at photography. And
Really?
He used to love. He takes really some beautiful photographs. Mm-hmm. But I remember that, and they used to have we used to do the slides, on a viewfinder.
Yeah.
And I illustrated all his, because he had this, it was called otosclerosis, that sometimes people get. It's where the bones become fixed. It's like almost like I think of arthritis. And
okay. Yep.
Bones become fixed, and then they don't vibrate, and then they don't conduct sound.
Bea occasionally struggles with her words or trails off throughout the interviews we conducted with her. Granted, she's in her senior years now, but what I hadn't known then when I first met her was that she was a stroke survivor. Thankfully, she was able to recover, and with support from her daughter Anna, she was able to return home and also to her artwork. I think it's important to mention this, not just to explain Bea to an audience, to give you a better idea of who she is, but also to point out her willingness to sit down and speak with us despite the hindrances of her health. We were very grateful for that. As fragile as Bea seemed when I was first introduced to her, I could also clearly see that she had an inner strength that had gotten her through some hard times and some real loss. Most notably, her son. You could also tell that even when she fumbled with those words, she was very careful with them. Very careful. I think I got a clearer picture of why when I started to learn more about Chip's father, the patriarch of the Robinson family, Mendell Robinson.
So he developed, I remember when he sort of invented this, it was made of stainless steel, teeny little prosthesis. Tiny, I mean, if you dropped it on the floor, you'd lose it. It was that tiny. And he would operate through the microscope, and he'd film at the same time, but then they were made into slides.
Wow.
And then from the slides, I had a viewfinder, and I did the illustrations. For a medical magazine, a medical journal, and Stort's Medical, they carry medical instruments, and they carried his prosthesis. But I did all the illustrations for that. It's called the Robinson stainless steel prosthesis.
Okay, let me take a second here and save you some Googling. Here's what the internet has to say. The Robinson stainless steel prosthesis is a type of tiny, piston-like implant used in the middle of the ear to restore hearing. It is used in a surgical procedure called a stapedectomy, primarily for treating conductive hearing loss caused by otosclerosis. The Robinson prosthesis was designed by Dr. Mendell Robinson and introduced to the public in the 1960s as a standardized, self-centering implant for stapedectomy. It had a 96% rate of success over a 20-year period when it was first introduced. So, yeah, if you could follow all that, you'd learn pretty quick that Mendell Robinson, Bea's husband, Chip's dad, was no slouch. He was a gifted surgeon and inventor who basically, for lack of better words, cured hearing loss for a great majority of his patients as far back as the 60s. On another note, if you ever wondered what inventing the cure for hearing loss for patients could do for you financially, you just need to visit the Robinson compound once. It's impressive, to say the least. Although it's changed over time as the family has gotten smaller and their needs have changed, at its height, it had several residences, barns, and fields on a sprawling patch of well over 200 acres. I'll talk about it further in another episode. Point being, this perspective on Chip's dad was certainly valuable insight because, as I learned, it offered a further glimpse into the lesser-known things about Chip. As talented as Mendell Robinson was, like many fathers, there was certainly a little room for improvement.
I think he and I were closer. His father was, his father really admired the work he did, but would never tell him. It's like he didn't show emotion very well or love very well. So my son never really, I think there are many times he felt his father didn't really love him. And he was, kind of more closer to me, I would say.
But he was proud of him, though.
My son, my husband.
Your husband was proud of his son?
Yes, yeah. But he would never really. Behind closed doors. But he never really, he never really told my son, in many ways, that he was.
Sure. And was there an expectation from the family that he was going to go into med school?
No, never, ever. Yeah, my son always. He never expressed. He would have been good at it too, but he never. I think his husband, my husband, his father, was so successful that might have been a deterrent, but he never expressed a desire, or want, and my husband never pressured him ever. He just did his own thing. My son.
Gotcha.
Yeah, he wasn't ever.
So even though he was interested in medical stuff.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, he was never. Yeah, because I think he felt his father was so successful that he never even wanted to attempt it.
Mendell Robinson had long been deceased by the time I was able to start to interview the Robinson family for this story. In the several interviews I did, I wasn't really able to form a complete opinion on him. Clearly, he was a gifted and successful doctor, As a husband and father, I wasn't as sure. He certainly provided for his family, especially financially. But it was his relationship with Chip that really interested me, as it clearly had some impact on Chip's view of himself. From the people interviewed, I also got a lot of mixed opinions about who Mendell Robinson really was. I'm still looking to make that determination.
Chip was a very kind, thoughtful person.
Yeah, great.
He's
What else
very,
about him?
He's very brilliant, very talented in many fields.
When Bea starts to reflect on Chip, you can clearly tell her tone has changed. It's a mix of love and, well, hardship. What was your favorite thing about him?
I think his kindness, his compassion.
Yeah. And when you think about the fact that here we are sitting here doing an interview about him today, how does that make you feel about his accomplishments and stuff? The fact that there's people that care enough to talk about him.
I'm very proud. Mm-hmm. I knew it was something he would want. We would, I'm very happy that I'm able to do that for him. Mm-hmm. But he really was a storyteller. But he loved this. I think he loved the fact that there was such an interest in his book. And this time, especially, he liked that, that people were interested at this time, especially this Halloween, this day. He liked the notoriety that people would, remember. But he himself did not believe in ghosts.
The phrase, "didn't believe in ghosts," hit me like a truck when Bea said it. It was totally surreal. I remember looking over at my producer, John, and him looking back at me wide-eyed when it was said. It was COVID, and we were all masked up, and his eyes alone were indication enough of how much this blew his mind as well. So let's get this straight. The dude who literally had the most famous ghost book from the area, who claimed to have interviewed hundreds of people about their paranormal experiences, who spent countless hours in cemeteries and at supposed haunted sites, was still apprehensive? It was a wild thought. Bea did backtrack a bit, though, and further elaborated. I'm not sure if my surprise threw her off.
But although he did, I shouldn't say that, because he also felt there was a time when people, pass away and they just can't, they're stuck in one place and then they remain to try to find, whatever they're searching for so they can move on. But yeah, it was more he was more scientific. You look at it more a scientific way, and that they were just stuck in one spot. They couldn't, they hadn't moved on yet.
Although the thought of talking about the nature of spirits and ghosts with Bea, the illustrator of what I thought was the coolest ghost book in the world, would be exciting, in a way, it was a little bit more awkward than anything else, for lack of a better word. It's a tough subject for the family. It still is, especially in the month of October, of which this interview took place. Her son Chip, a man who dedicated a large portion of his life to the fascination with ghosts, paranormal, and life after death, was now deceased. I'll spare the specific details at this juncture, but the reality was, it was determined to be the result of his own doing. Suicide. In my time of researching Chip, I made it a point to pursue the why behind this, at least as much as I could. As someone who had clinical depression in the past, I knew personally it wasn't something that always had a clear answer of why someone would take their own life. I still wanted a better understanding, though, of why a successful writer would turn down such a dark path in his final years. It's fascinating that here's your husband, who's an ear doctor, who creates this amazing invention, and at the same time, I think it was Anna, we had heard before that the last few years of Chip's life he had hearing issues.
Well, yeah, it was.
Can you that's kind of an interesting scenario to think.
Well, that was part of his illness, really.
Gotcha.
I don't know if because he just became very, very paranoid towards the end.
Sure. We can talk about that another day.
But that was what was,
It was related to that. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. Paranoid. Sickness. Those were the words she used. At the time, I didn't know what she meant by that. And as I point out in this interview, I didn't want to get into it at that point either, especially in our first sit-down meeting together. Bea was already growing fatigued after sitting with us for several hours, and pushing an 80-year-old stroke survivor about the dark side of her son's reality wasn't exactly in my wheelhouse. I made the determination not to push her, at least not at that point. I also want to make a point at this juncture here for the audience, for the family, and really for my own peace of mind. As we learn more about Chip's story, I'm not trying to sensationalize the part of Chip that was, well, harder to listen to. Chip's story's complicated. He was complicated. And his paranoia, or sickness, as it's been referred to, is important to the story, in more ways than one. The long and short is that after further discussions with family and friends, is that I started to get an understanding of the side of Chip Robinson I didn't know. The side that wasn't part of the narrative of him that I built in my head from the time that I was a little kid. It was a part of his life where the stories he wrote weren't the only thing that was haunted. We'll discuss this next time on The New England Ghost Files, Resurrected. If you have any information that could help shed light on Chip Robinson's story or the New England Ghost Files, please reach out to us at newenglandghostfiles@gmail.com. If you were interviewed by Chip Robinson for one of his stories, we're very interested in hearing from you. Please reach out. The New England Ghost Files Resurrected is written and produced by me, Tommy Whalen. Mixing, mastering, and sound is done with help from Gary Lawrence, John Werski Jr., and Authentic Radical Stories. Ghost File narration is done by Eric R. Paradise.